The wind did not whisper in the capital. It howled, coarse and dry, carrying with it the scent of scorched parchment and bone dust. The imperial city sat silent beneath the desert sun, its golden towers worn grey by time and tyranny. Statues of forgotten gods loomed over empty courtyards. No birds sang, no children played. Only the low clang of temple bells echoed, as if tolling for something long dead but never buried. At the center of it all sat the throne, carved from obsidian and inlaid with lapis tears. They called it the ash-cloaked throne, not for its color, but for the man who sat on it, Emperor Kellis IV, last of the fire-born kings. He ruled not by sword nor by scroll, but by signs, celestial alignments, goat entrails, and the cracked bones of newborns. His word was law only when it came from the stars. He was a man consumed by prophecy, his ears deaf to reason, his heart beaten into submission by omens. The people feared him, but not as one fears a tyrant. They feared him as they feared earthquakes or eclipses, as something unnatural ordained, and vengeful in the chambers behind the throne. Wrapped in silks, embroidered with protective glyphs, lived the Empress Alira, 20 years old, barely more than a girl, with storm-colored eyes and a quiet voice that lingered like incense. After prayer, she was beloved by the people. She did not speak in riddles or blood, but in poetry and kindness. It was she who restored the city's fountains, who visited the sick in their sleep mats, who sang lullabies from balconies while the empire cracked beneath her feet. She was also 6 months pregnant, and that alone made her dangerous. The prophecy, first spoken a generation ago, had long been dismissed as a relic of madness. When the womb quickens, the kingdom rots. It was a line found etched beneath an old temple floor, surrounded by bones and blood. Scholars claimed it referenced a plague, priests claimed it meant revolution, but to Kellis, it meant one thing only: betrayal by birth. Alira's pregnancy was not a miracle. It was a threat. The royal astrologers, skeletal men with ink-stained fingers and hollowed-out eyes, charted constellations by candlelight and declared the child cursed. The moon was in retrograde. A comet had split the sky in two. The child's due date aligned with the day of the drowned suns, an omen last seen before the empire's first great famine. Kellis listened, not to his heart, not to his wife, but to the cosmos that fed his paranoia. He began to unravel, thread by thread, robe by robe. Night after night, he stalked the palace halls barefoot, whispering to paintings, tracing sigils in the dust. He claimed to see his dead mother in the mirror. He claimed the child spoke to him in dreams, promising ruin. Alira grew pale. Her once warm laughter vanished like smoke. Guards were stationed outside her room, not to protect her, but to contain. Her midwives were dismissed. Her letters stopped leaving the palace. Outside, whispers filled the markets. "She's with child," they murmured. "She's the end of us," others hissed. "No," said the old women with cracked hands. "She's our only hope." Inside the throne room, Kellis made no such distinctions. He began the fast of the Black Month. No food, no water, no sleep, only incense, prayer, and visions of fire. The city's priests wrapped him in veils of white ash and prepared the sacred texts for what came next in his journal. A final line scratched in frantic ink: "The child will be born in fire, or the empire will die in ash." The palace no longer echoed with music. It creaked under its own silence, beneath its own fear. Shadows lengthened across marble floors, and the torches lining the corridors flickered as though uncertain they should burn. Every corner of the imperial citadel seemed to inhale, but never exhale. Something was coming in the inner sanctum, deeper than any map dared mark. The oracular chamber sat beneath the earth like a buried tumor. It was said to be carved from the bone of a dead mountain, lined with teeth pulled from the mouths of saints and madmen. There, beneath layers of salt and soot, Kellisfer knelt before the High Seer, a man whose eyes had been sewn shut decades ago so he could see clearly. A bronze bowl of entrails steamed between them, the smell of blood, bile, and burning. Herbs stung the lungs. The High Seer, frail but trembling with purpose, dipped his hands into the warm viscera and gasped. "She carries two fates," he rasped, voice dry as paper. "One will kill a king, the other will kill the sky." Kellis's jaw clenched. Which one lives? The oracle merely smiled. A tooth fell from his mouth into the bowl, and the blood turned black. That night, Kellis returned to his chambers with the look of a man who had seen his own grave. He bathed in oil, wrapped himself in deer hide, and carved protective glyphs into his own chest with a golden blade. He stared at the stars for hours, lips quivering with silent questions. He did not sleep, and across the palace, Alira did not dream. She had not been outside in 19 days. Her room, once a sanctuary of silks, perfumes, and painted walls, had become a cage. The windows were sealed with black wax. The midwives had been replaced by priests in red robes, their eyes hollow, their hands gloved. They did not speak unless to chant. They did not touch her unless to inspect. Alira's body no longer felt like hers. It felt like an artifact, a sacred vessel, passed between zealots and scholars, like something too dangerous to be human. Each day she awoke, 2 new symbols chalked on her walls. Each night she was given herbs that dulled her senses, made her tongue heavy and her thoughts slippery. But she remembered enough. She remembered when Khalees used to hold her hand under the stars, when he spoke of their child like it was salvation, when he promised her that no prophecy would ever outrank love. Now, he would not look her in the eyes. One evening, she caught her reflection in a polished silver tray. Her skin had turned almost translucent. She could see the purple rivers of her veins, the sharp bone of her collar, and the gentle swell of life beneath her ribs. She placed her hand on her stomach and whispered to the child, "You are not a weapon." But outside her door, the priests sharpened blades not meant for war. Throughout the palace, the staff grew quieter. Servants bowed lower. Eyes never rose. The walls themselves seemed to draw closer. Fear was not spoken. It was breathed. The emperor had declared a holy quarantine. No messages in or out. The empire was told the empress was unwell, that the child might bring plague, that the gods required obedience in the face of divine uncertainty. But in private, Kellis wrote a single decree to his inner council, sealed with the crimson mark of finality. If the stars betray us, so must she. They came for her before. Dawn, the sky was the color of dried blood. A thin red haze stretching across the horizon, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The bells of the outer temple did not ring. No one was permitted to watch. But still, the city held its silence like a breath under water. Every window shuttered, every hand trembling over a prayer bead. Alira did not scream when they entered. She sat upright in bed, her hands folded across the gentle swell of her stomach. Her eyes, dim but defiant, met the robed men who moved like shadows across her chamber. 2 of them held a white veil between them, embroidered with burning suns, and open eyes. Another held a ceremonial dagger. None met her gaze. She asked only one question: "Will it be quick?" No one answered. Outside, the pyre had been prepared in secret. It stood at the center of the sacred grove, where the old kings were crowned, where rain was once summoned by blood. Atop a stone altar, wrapped in salt-drenched cloth, the firewood had been stacked with obsessive precision: cedar, myrrh, and blackened ironwood. At its base lay scrolls written in the first tongue, their words said to blind those who dared read them aloud. The high seer stood beside the altar, holding a torch soaked in lamb's fat and rosewater. His mouth moved constantly, though no sound emerged. His eyes, still sewn shut, wept tears of blood. When a lyra was brought forth, veiled and barefoot, a gust of wind tore through the grove, strong enough to scatter the ash from old burnings, strong enough to make the gathered priests shudder. The emperor watched from the colonnade above, surrounded by guards in silver masks. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He had not eaten in 4 days. The ritual began with the reading of the 9 omens, a litany of signs: a black-winged bird nesting in the royal stables, a stillborn calf born with 2 hearts, a dream of water turning to glass. Each omen was followed by a chant. Each chant invoked fire as both purifier and judge. A lyra was led to the altar. They laid her gently atop the pyre. As though preparing a bride, her veil was removed. Her face, pale, wet with dew, turned toward the emperor. She mouthed something to him. No one could hear it, but Kellis flinched as if stabbed. The high seer raised the torch. And for a moment, time held still. The silence was not absence. It was grief made tangible, hovering like smoke before the flame. Somewhere a crow cawed. Somewhere the child moved, then flame-kissed, oil-soaked cedar. Then the veil caught light. Then the screams began. She screamed for the first 10 seconds, a sound that cut through the palace like a shard of glass. But then the smoke took her voice, and only the crackle of prophecy remained. Some say she called the child's name. Some say she cursed Kellis in tongues older than memory. But most say this: she did not scream for herself. She screamed for the child. When the flames finally died, all that remained was scorched stone and the faint outline of her body in ash. The priests collected what they called holy residue: teeth, bone fragments, a scrap of fabric with the royal crest burned through. The emperor ordered that nothing be buried. No grave, he said. No monument, no return. And so, the child who never drew breath, and the mother who dared to cradle it, were given to fire in the name of stars that never wept, and gods that never answered. The first plague came 7 days after the fire. It was not of rats or boils, nor blood in the water. It was silence, an unnatural stillness that settled over the empire like a funeral shroud. The birds vanished. The dogs stopped barking. Even the children, wide-eyed and hungry, spoke in whispers, as if afraid the ash could still hear. What had been done in the grove could not be undone. The air changed. It carried a weight invisible but felt in the bones. Crops withered before the harvest. Goats miscarried. Wells turned sour, and fish floated dead beneath the surface. People began leaving offerings at the edge of the grove, dolls made of wheat, blood-soaked cloth, bits of honey and bone. No one dared speak her name, but they built altars in secret. They prayed not to the emperor, but to the burned woman, to To the ash. Kale did not speak of her again. He closed the palace gates and declared a second month of purification. He claimed the ritual had saved the empire from unseen forces. He issued proclamations of celestial favor, spoke of signs in the sky, claimed that the sacrifice had reversed the curse. But the people saw what followed, and they remembered. Inside the palace, the emperor withered. He wore only robes of soot. He refused to sleep in his chambers, choosing instead to lie beside the altar where her ashes had cooled. He claimed to hear the child's heartbeat in the wind, claimed he saw her eyes in the moon's reflection on his dagger. At night, he wandered, barefoot through the corridors, trailing ash across polished stone. He'd whisper to doors that no longer opened, stare at portraits that had been slashed, and claw at the floor like an animal digging for something lost. Some say he stopped being a man, he became a vessel. The high priests, now drunk on the blood-soaked power of fulfilled prophecy, took control of the court. Edicts were passed to destroy any record of Alira's existence. Her letters were burned, her portraits scraped from the palace wall with iron. Her servants were reassigned or vanished without word. Even her name was removed from the birth registers of her province. But the people refused to forget. In the outer villages, her story grew wild, rooted in grief and watered by guilt. Some said she had ascended, now living among the stars, holding her unborn child like a son in her arms. Others believed her spirit roamed the city at night, a woman-shaped shadow, weeping flame. Crops that failed were said to be touched by her mourning. Babies born sick were said to carry the fire in their blood. One girl, barely 12, walked into the sacred grove at dusk with a knife and carved a name into the stone. Altar. Alira. She was never seen again, and yet more followed. The empire, once bound by banners and bloodlines, began to split along quieter lines between those who spoke her name in secret and those who worshipped the fire that devoured her. Kelis, once called divine, was now called hollow. He decreed new laws. No pregnancies without priestly blessing, no birth without ritual approval, no woman permitted to name her own child. He believed this would end the fear. Instead, it deepened it, because every time a mother clutched her womb in fear, every time a baby cried beneath a red moon, every time a girl lit a candle and placed it in a window, the empire remembered. They remembered that their emperor had burned his own hope, and that the kingdom, once mighty, had begun to feast on its own heart, one prophecy, one child, one mother at a time. Years later, when the empire lay fractured and its cities strangled by dust, a parchment was found brittle as dead leaves, hidden behind a false wall in the temple archives. It was not sealed with wax, but with a strand of human hair. The ink was rusted brown, the letters curled and ornate. It was not a prophecy. It was a script. A careful translation revealed it had been written by the high seer's scribe, a lowly servant whose name was erased, but whose handwriting matched dozens of other official declarations. The so-called womb prophecy was not ancient. It had been composed the year before Alira conceived, drafted, rehearsed, and delivered like theatre. The meaning was clear. The omen that condemned the empress was manufactured. The blood, the bones, the rituals, all born. From ink and ambition, the conspiracy traced upward, a web of robed men hungry not for truth, but control. At the heart of it was the high seer, blind, revered, and hollow inside. His mouth spoke riddles, but his hands signed documents for land, gold, and soldiers. He had not foreseen anything. He had orchestrated everything, because Kellis was never truly emperor. He was a mirror, and the priests behind him cast the reflection they needed. They saw Alira's influence, her gentleness, her growing popularity, and most of all, her independence. She questioned temple decisions. She insisted on naming her child before the priests could. She taught palace girls to read. She stopped a planned sacrifice once, calling it theatrics dressed in sanctity. That was her true crime. She did not fear them, and for that she had to become a lesson. The script of the prophecy was presented at a secret tribunal years later, when the old empire had split into 3 warring provinces. A young scholar, barely 20, like Alira had been, read it aloud before a hall of widows, scribes, and generals. When she finished, no one spoke for a long time. One woman stood and asked, "Does the emperor know?" Another replied, "He wrote the signature." Historians believe Kellis had come to suspect the deception in his final years. His journal entries recovered from beneath a sealed floorboard grow increasingly erratic. He writes of voices, that lie of fire that turns to ice, of a child he sees in dreams holding a crown made of thorns. One entry reads, "They handed me fear dressed in flame and told me it was salvation. I believed them. I lit the match. I watched her eyes become stars, and still the sky did not change." Some say he tried to unwrite the prophecy, sought out foreign mystics, burned scrolls, even considered carving new omens into stone to overwrite the old. But the story was no longer his. It belonged to the people, to the fear, to the fire. The priests had succeeded beyond their imagining. They replaced faith with terror, and Alira, who had never read the stars, never demanded thrones, never uttered a curse, had been devoured by men who feared her voice more than their gods. In the years that followed, the ashes of that truth spread, whispered first in university halls, then across rebel camps, then into the songs of exiled women who carried the tale across borders. The prophecy was hollow. The oracle's teeth were rotten, and the empire had slaughtered its most sacred hope, not because of fate, but because of fear. No records remain of the child's name. Some say she whispered it before the flames took her, soft, defiant, and laced with hope. Others claim she never had the chance, that the name was still forming in her mind when the torch was lit. And yet, across the empire's fractured remnants, the story of the child that never was grew louder than any name ever could. In the decades that followed, the child became legend, not a prince, not a princess, not a curse, but a question. A child never born, yet impossible to forget. A soul suspended between myth and memory. Some believed the child had survived, snatched from the pyre by a brave midwife and smuggled through the aqueducts beneath the palace. They say she raised the child in a mountain monastery, where it learned silence, scripture, and sword. These tales claim the child grew into a figure cloaked in white, speaking in riddles and leading revolts in the emperor's name, not for vengeance, but truth. Others believed the opposite, that the child's soul was trapped in the grove, forever reliving the moment of death. Villagers left toys by the scorched altar, a spinning top, a stuffed deer, a wooden flute, as if hoping to soothe a ghost that had never cried. Midwives would report seeing small footprints in the ash. Candles would flicker. A lullaby would echo from nowhere. But the truth was this: there was no child, only grief where one should have been. And it was that absence, not the fire, not the prophecy, that haunted the people most. In a remote village to the south, mothers began sewing dolls from cloths soaked in milk and myrrh. They named them for the unborn, Ira, Solon, Kale, Ashen. Every year on the day of the burnt moon, they placed them in shallow graves and whispered blessings meant for lives that never came. Grow where no root has held, they would say. Sleep where no heart ever beat. In the palace, hollowed and overrun with dust, Kellis roamed without robes, muttering to empty halls. His council begged him to remarry, to sire another heir, to rewrite the line that had been lost. He refused. The line is ash, he murmured. I held it in my hands and watched the wind take it. He began painting the unborn child on palace walls, sometimes with wings, sometimes as a shadow, sometimes as a sun with bleeding rays. He never painted the empress, only the child, but the eyes were always hers. The priests tried to erase the images. They scrubbed them with vinegar and salt, painted over them with gold, but they always returned, sometimes overnight, sometimes in places no one had entered in years. It was as if the palace itself remembered, as if the walls wept for a child that had never seen light. Elsewhere, the myth of the child became fuel for 1,000 rebellions. Each faction claimed it as their own. Some saw it as divine, a second coming, aborted by fear. Others saw it as justice denied, proof of imperial corruption. Poets wrote verses in its name. Painters etched its imagined face onto wood and glass. No two depictions looked the same, because no one could agree on what the child was meant to become, only that it could have changed everything. And in that void, that unbearable what-if, the empire found its most unshakable curse. Not the fire, not the prophecy, but the eternal echo of footsteps that never fell. She was not the first. Long before Alira's scream melted into flame, long before the prophecy was inked and weaponized, the world had already known the ritual, the slow murder of mothers, for the comfort of men and the illusion of order, in a highland kingdom now lost beneath jungle and ash. Archaeologists uncovered a pit lined with bones, women in late pregnancy, their pelvises shattered, buried with golden masks and silence. Inscribed on a stone nearby were the words, "To birth is to tempt the gods." In a northern empire swallowed by ice, a queen was drowned with her newborn twins during the eclipse of a dying sun. She had ruled briefly while her husband warred. Across the sea, when he returned, victorious and paranoid, he claimed her womb had grown in betrayal. Her death was a cleansing, a restoration of masculine fate. In ancient Anatolia, tablets speak of the heat ritual, where royal concubines who conceived without permission were burned alive with copper rings nailed into their palms. The smoke said to bring rain in times of drought, across centuries and continents. The pattern repeats like a song. Women made sacred by creation, women punished for it. Fire not as warmth, but as verdict. Alira's immolation, then, was not an anomaly. It was a verse in an old, horrifying hymn, a note in a choir, of burning mothers. They were silenced in the name of stability, of prophecy, of empire, of God, but the silence did not hold. In the ruins of the sacred grove, women gather still. They bring ash and milk. They wear veils of soot. They do not speak above a whisper, but their presence defies the centuries of fear. One carves a name into stone. Another hums a song she was taught in secret, passed down by her grandmother. These are not rituals of worship. They are rituals of remembrance, because even if history tried to erase her, and the many like her, the scars remain on the land, on the bloodlines, on the way women still walk slightly quieter when they're alone, on the way mothers touch their bellies at night and pray their love is not mistaken for rebellion. And so, in hidden circles, the stories of the burned mothers are told not as tragedy, but as resistance. Their pain becomes a psalm. Their deaths become the firelight in which daughters see the truth. Poets, in exile, write, "We are the daughters of the ash, born not from womb alone, but from fire that did not kill us." Identical compositions without collaboration. A woman wrapped in flame, holding a faceless infant, standing at the threshold between darkness and dawn. They are outlawed, confiscated, destroyed. But they return again and again. Even the high temple, now ruled by the grandsons of the very priests who lit the torch, cannot contain it. Their prayers grow louder, their punishments harsher. But the flames do not obey them anymore, because Alira, though gone now, sings in chorus. Her scream joined that of queens, concubines, and commoners, the long-burning agony of women, who dared to hold life and were met with death. Together, they do not mourn, they warn, and their choir made of ash blood, and memory is no longer afraid to be heard. He outlived them all, the priests who whispered fire into his ear, the generals who nodded through silence, even the high seer who died choking on his own tongue mid-prayer. Kelis the Fourth, once emperor of flame, died nameless and unburied, beneath a sky that no longer recognized him. But his death did not begin with his final breath. It began with forgetting, as the empire crumbled, torn apart by famine, rebellion, and memory. His likeness was scraped from temple walls. Statues once bathed in gold were toppled and left to rot in public squares. Children threw stones at what was left of his marble face. His name was struck from the records by decree of the new republic. Coins bearing his image were melted into blades, and yet, even as the empire worked to erase him, the smell of him lingered, smoke and salt. Like guilt carried on wind inside the palace, abandoned for years, dust blanketed the throne room like snow. Crows nested in the rafters. Moss climbed the columns where once nobles bowed. Lay the cracked black throne, the seat he had refused to leave. Even as the world dissolved around him, it was said that Kelis never recovered from Alira's death. Not truly. He aged poorly, skin drawn, tight over a body starved of sleep and soul. His hair fell out in clumps. He spoke to shadows. He accused the stars of betrayal. He kept a vial of her ashes round his neck until his final hour in the last recorded sighting. He was seen walking barefoot across the palace roof during a storm, whispering to the wind, "I burned the future to save the past." And still, the sky stayed silent. He died in the eastern wing, alone, surrounded by half-finished paintings of a faceless child. No burial was arranged, no tomb carved. The revolutionaries refused to enshrine him. They left his body where it fell, bones and dust, beneath a portrait he had torn in half decades earlier. But Alira, she was never buried either, and yet she did not vanish. The people, forbidden to speak her name, began to whisper it into soil. As they planted crops, they sewed it into their daughters' dresses. They painted it in invisible ink on the backs of doorframes. Entire villages renamed their wells in her honor. Alira's water, Alira's mercy, Alira's womb in the coastal. Provinces, women gathered on solstice nights and carried white veils through fire, not to mourn her, but to reclaim her. They sang songs she once hummed, recreated recipes she once gifted to market vendors, and lit lanterns made of sea glass to float down rivers in her name. She became the nation's quiet god, not one of power, but of protection, and in that transformation, From woman to symbol, from victim to myth, the empire that tried to burn her out of history instead made her eternal. One shrine remains, hidden behind a broken aqueduct in the north, inside. Etched into the wall in the Empress's own hand, scrawled before her execution in the margins of a forgotten book of poetry, is the only surviving sentence written in her voice. They will forget his fire, but not my warmth. And so, the crown, once gilded in prophecy and fear, now rests forgotten in the dust, while her memory walks barefoot through the dreams of every daughter, born since, wrapped in ash, wrapped in love, unburned, centuries past. The empire, once carved in obsidian and ruled by omens, dissolved into legend. Dust buried its temples, vine roots split its palaces, sandstorms swallowed the roads once lined with screaming crowds. History, ever merciful to the powerful and forgetful, began to smooth the sharpest edges of its cruelty. But not all fires go out. In a nameless desert, in what was once the empire's southern province, archaeologists uncovered the remnants of a shrine. Beneath layers of soot and collapsed stone, they found a small chamber, untouched by time, unpillaged by treasure seekers. Its walls were painted not in gold, but in charcoal. At its center, a mural, faded, fragile, yet still burning. A woman, cloaked in flame, her face serene, cradled a child not yet born. Around them swirled stars, constellations known to no modern sky, and beneath her feet, a crown shattered into 3 pieces. They didn't know her name, but the women on the team wept when they saw her. Later, when the bones were catalogued, they found a fragment of a jaw scorched but intact, carbon dated to the time of Kellis IV. Embedded in the enamel of one tooth was a trace mineral only found in royal embalming oils. She had been someone important, and someone forgotten until now the discovery sparked a movement. Not political, not religious, something older, something human. Women across the world, historians, poets, mothers, began to speak her story aloud. Her name, reconstructed from shards of erased records and whispered folklore, returned to the world a Lyra. She was written back into textbooks, not as a queen, but as a martyr. In school children's plays, she was portrayed not in flame, but in light. In protest chants across seas, her name became a symbol for those silenced before. Their stories could begin, for the child that never was, for the womb that burned, for the fire that dared to love, a Lyra, the empress who never ruled, the mother who never gave birth, the woman who was supposed to disappear but refused. Her legacy became a mirror, for every voice silenced by power, for every life stolen by fear, for every body turned to ash for daring to create, to question, to hope. And so, though the empire fell, though its gods turned to dust, its throne to ruin, she remained not in marble, not in monuments, but in memory, the most defiant ember of all, a single mural, a single name, enough to burn through centuries of silence, because no fire is eternal, except the one lit by truth, by love denied, by a scream that echoes longer than history is willing to listen. The child never born, the mother never mourned, the prophecy that failed, and the flame that would not die.